Hi, and welcome to another episode of Architecture of Change. I am your host, Leanne Mair, and welcome to Series 2, Episode 2. Now, today's topic is actually, I would say, a personal one. And it's also, I would say, a complex one. Now, I have been known to say you only ever have two choices, yes or no. Which in and of itself isn't incorrect to say. The problem is when you make a statement like that, is that it fundamentally um undermines and ignores power structures. So you're right, you can only ever say yes or no. But there are so many situations where neither of those answers are truly an option that is conducive to your success. Neither of those options are conducive to your success because there is so much around organizational framing, cultural expectations, parental expectations. And I'll just give one one of the topics that is definitely going to be coming up more often, especially now, which is like comp season. And very, very much at the beginning of my career, I somehow very mistakenly believed that I was going to be able to influence that conversation, that I was going to be able to say no because. But the reality was that was never what the options were that were available to me. The only options that I really realistically had was, yes, okay, thank you very much, or no, I don't agree with this. It didn't change the outcome. It didn't change the outcome. And I think sometimes when we make judgments, and I'm going to use the word judgments on other people's decisions, just as much as we judge ourselves for making particular decisions, we sometimes forget that there is a framework, there is a power dynamic that almost primes you or pushes you into believing you have an option. But when you sit down and take stock and take note of it, the reality is that the outcomes of either of those things are not in your interests, but you only genuinely have those two options. And this is sometimes why choice can feel like a mirage, and why understanding, and I know in another episode we talked about, power is very much concentrated. And within the space of building your career, a lot of the things that you would like to do are actually already, in many cases, predefined. And when they're not predefined, it also doesn't necessarily mean that you have the opportunity to then chart your own path, taking it very literally, your career path. Your boss might not have any sort of transparency or even any idea where they can see you going. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the choice to navigate it or create a path for yourself. And I think sometimes that's the hardest thing for us to recognize, that we don't always really realistically have choice. But the one thing that we do have, which is different, is agency. Agency allows us to sometimes circumnavigate, and I have to be heavy on sometimes, circumnavigate what choices have been taken away from us. What choices have been taken away from us. Because this construct around organizational framework, cultural framings, expectations, these are all designed to ensure that we take very particular steps, in some cases for our own benefit, in most cases, not really, for somebody else's benefit. And I think that is um, one of the hardest, I'm not going to say lesson, I'm going to say experiences and challenges to learn. Because as much as we are encouraged to use your voice, speak out, speak up, and I'm talking about kind of when you're not getting, when you're not seeing career progression, when you're not getting that promotion, when you're not getting that pay rise. The reality is that within that, there is very little scope to move unless you are enacting agency and using your agency in ways such as having a sponsor. I talked about before in another video, building your campaign, as it were, so that when you get to comp season, you are almost undeniable. It is almost irrefutable. But that being said, even with all of those things, the power behind the power structure, the organizational structure, the governance that is there, doesn't always mean that agency can change those choices. And sometimes the questions that we have to ask ourselves when it comes to choice is, are the yeses or nos going to get me to where I want to go? First question. Second question, is the power structure that's in place going to allow me to use my agency to be able to change any of those outcomes? Because I think the most frustrating thing sometimes about moving into the workplace is that as much as we want to feel like we have more options because we are older, we are wiser, we're more experienced, we are doing more, we've learned more, we've got so much, we've taken so much with us. The reality is sometimes that all of those things become irrelevant when the outcome of what your position is and the role that you play is already determined. And when I figured that out, there's a good side and there's a bad side to it, right? You know how they say, don't try and spend too much time, don't put too much energy into things that you can't control. I can control my yes or my no, but that doesn't necessarily mean I can control the outcome. But knowing that I have gone into a decision aware of what the outcomes are meant to be, even if I don't particularly like them, still creates a sense of agency and still creates a sense of autonomy that says, okay, I am not letting life, career, boss lead me, but I'm actively making those decisions because sometimes it's between a rock and a hard place. And it's not always a bad thing, right? It's not always a bad thing that there can be the illusion of choice. It's just recognizing that sometimes choice is an illusion, right? It does exist, of course it does, but sometimes it is an illusion. And I sometimes think that a lot of people who are successful have been afforded the privilege of their choices that they were given aligning with their goals. The friction always comes when the choices that you've been given are not the ones that you want. Whether it's, we think this role is better for you, when you know that that's not what you want to do. Whether it's the suggestion that you take a DEI role in order to progress, when that's not where your skill set has ever laid, but that's what the organization has determined. And if you say, no, thank you, I'll continue as I am, you also know that that's career suicide within that organization. For later use to say, well, you weren't really interested. So there we go. We needed you and you didn't play ball, as it were. So the question is, how do we get to the point that choice becomes our choices? And that is where being, and it depends, of course, but sometimes this is the point of observation. And this is the point, and I understand why it also becomes really important that when you have a goal in mind, that you're also looking to see, well, if the person is in this role and I'd like to get to there, what is it that I need to do to get there, and how did they get there? Because when you see that someone's done it before, and I know a lot of times people talk about, what did they say? You can't be what you can't see. I'm atrocious with sayings. I'm so sorry. You can't be what you can't see. And they're right on one. They're right from the inspiration of you can't be what you can't see. But from a very strategic one, you can't be what you can't see, because sometimes you're not allowed to plot your own path. But when you see it, there's already a named path in front of you, which makes it easier to be strategic and align yourself with, how do I get to that next stage? What is it that this person did? And it's not that everybody's route has to be the same, but it's sometimes recognizing that the permissible options, that the choices that are allowed, are easier to achieve if somebody has already done it. It's easier to achieve if somebody has already done it. And that for me is always why the phrase, you can't be what you can't see, becomes important, because it creates the opportunity of choice, as well as inspiration, of course, but choice. One of the most destabilizing things for any organization, unfortunately, is somebody who wants to chart their own path, somebody who wants to be a trailblazer, unless it is part of the choice that they are given. Most of the time, it's really destabilizing when someone says, well, I can actually be. I see that. If nobody else has done it, there is a very, very small group of people, very, very small group, and it's completely aligned with the power structure. It's completely aligned with the power pyramid. Who gets the chance to have real choice is aligned with the structure of the power pyramid. And we see it time and time again. We see it in the reporting. When we talk about the promotions of Black women, when we're talking about the promotions of women of color, when we're talking about who gets VC funding, it's the reverberations of who is allowed to have choice, the reverberations of who gets to choose what the outcomes are, always reflect the same thing. Always reflect the same thing. And this is sometimes why it's not even sometimes, this is why it is unsurprising that so many Black women are leaving corporate or have such a high level of side hustles. It's almost expected, because choice is predominantly an illusion, especially when you have ambition that cannot be envisioned in the same way by those who manage you or by those who invest in you. And this is why when we think about choice, or we think about the decisions people make in order to progress, we have to take a step back. Most of the time you think to yourself, why is someone doing that? Like, why would she do that? Why is she taking that role? That doesn't even make sense. Potentially because she didn't have choice. And this is her agency she is now using to create real choice, or a better version of choice. And it's not surprising then that when we look at the proportion of people who do have a straight up career, it's not surprising that the number is few, and that there are very, very few people, maybe I said too many varies, but very few people who belong to minoritized and marginalized groups that are afforded the same opportunities of having that straight up the ladder progression, because it's all intertwined with the architecture of choice, which is backed by the power pyramid and power structures. And that is sometimes what we forget, that choice is framed for us in many cases. It's not always free will. It's not always of my own volition. And sometimes it's not always designed in a personal context anyway, from a place of malintent. Sometimes it's the perspective of, we're doing this for your own good. Whether it's you are going to uni, it's either this one or that one. That's a framed choice, as opposed to I would not like to go to uni and I would like to do something else. I'd like to start working, for example. And that has really, this concept around, for me, the architecture of choice has led me to kind of change. And we all judge, even if this TikTok trend says we listen and we don't judge, we all judge. But when I thought about this part around the illusion and architecture of choice, it made me think differently as to how I formed opinions, or, saw things, or even when you kind of look back, and I'm sure, as I said, at this point in the year, I'm sure we're all reflective for many different reasons, thinking about our achievements, thinking about missed opportunities, thinking about what could I have done better in certain situations. I'm not saying that this expunges the record, but I'm saying that once we take a step back and think about the landscape of the choices we made, there are moments that we didn't really make a choice. There was only really ever one option, but it was just packaged in a way that made it feel like it was. And it's also to say, like, don't judge yourself too harshly. When you're forced to make decisions, either personally or professionally, that don't feel like a good one. They feel like you've made a mistake. Because we all come across that. We all come across those moments where the decision that you make is either way you don't feel happy with it. Either way you feel like you have betrayed is a strong word, but you have deviated away from your ideals. Because this is I would say one of the largest challenges, especially for those in roles of people management, is that sometimes you are forced to deviate away from your ideals because your organization has required it of you. Your organization has determined that this is the outcome that they want, and you can either do it this way or the other way, whether that's job cuts or, never directly said so, restructurings or whatever. But it doesn't feel like it's done in a way, or it's not done on a what we're going to call a fair basis. It's done on a this is what we're going to do and you have to execute basis. And I think that we have to give ourselves more grace, not in everything, but just in that part of recognizing and giving ourselves a recognition around understanding the dynamics of some of the situations that we're in. And that it's just not that straightforward. It's just not that straightforward. We'd like it to be. It would be great if it was. But there is so much complexity around the architecture and illusion of choice sometimes that it becomes difficult to really see where the smoke and mirrors are. So what is my recommendation? What is my recommendation? My recommendation is the following. When someone wants to hurry you to make a decision, always ask yourself the question, why? What is the hurry? If it's a meaningful decision, then it needs time. And I don't know how much that time is. It's dependent on any situation. But big decisions can't be made in seconds. They need time. When you're being asked to make a decision that feels like it's deviating away from your values, question, not to the person, but just to yourself, what is the outcome? Can I make a counter suggestion? And what would, and when I say counter suggestion, when they talk about, finding midways, it's usually suggesting the most radical thing that that they're not going to do, but then the compromise is still more radical than they originally suggested and less radical than you wanted, but it's somewhere in the middle. Sometimes that suggestion might be the authentic way you would have liked to have dealt with the situation. And finding a middle ground. And the third one is, and this is always the biggest question when it comes to choice, if you make any of these decisions that do not feel aligned to your values or feel like a value deviation, can you live with it? And if you can't live with it, what's the outcome and the consequence of that? Because sometimes I feel, as I said at the outset of this conversation, me saying, oh yeah, you only ever have the decision of, the choice of yes or no. Correct on one hand, but very much ignorant on the other because it ignored context and landscape. And part of, lifestyle architecture and creating space for success is taking the time we need and saying, look, I need time to make this decision, et cetera, taking the time we need to be aware of our choices, strategic around our choices. It doesn't mean we're going to always get them right. It doesn't mean we're not going to look back and when we're reflecting on things that could have gone better, that may not change, and that's okay. But it's more around not allowing ourselves to be pushed into making decisions when we haven't been able to give ourselves the opportunity to think about the landscape and the context. Taking that time to think about the bigger implications of the choices that you're being offered, the bigger implications of the expected outcomes. It doesn't always mean that it's going to change the fundamental outcome, but it will change how you interact with those choices that you make. It will change how you feel about yourself in that space. It will change how you feel about where you are in life in general. Because as much as you will have recognized that there is a framing and a framework behind the choices you were given, you've also accepted that you willingly made those decisions, aware of those outcomes, aware of those consequences, if you will, in doing so. And that's once again being intentional, using your agency to do that. How do we get there? I mean, that's a longer conversation and a different type of and a workshop rather than a podcast. But that's one of the things that we have to start thinking more about, I believe, is, do I really have a choice here? And if I don't really genuinely have a choice, then what is behind this? And where do I feel? And is it possible for me to even feel comfortable with that choice? Because ultimately, everything that we're doing as the individual, everything that we're trying to do is to make things better. And I talk about the 3 layers: on the individual level, on the collective level, and on the societal level. And then, the collective can even fit into, organizational as well in between before we get to societal. And all these things are interconnected because of the foundation upon which they sit. But like with the hidden architecture of money and so many things, there is a curtain, there is smoke in front of this, so we can't always see it clearly. And I hope that this episode, once again, it's about deconstructing systems and having conversations and creating conversation starters and driving food for thought. What have been situations that you've had where you've thought this hasn't been aligned? One of those moments appeared, if you think back, and it doesn't have to be that you comment now, it might be something you send later, but when have you realized that the choice was never a choice and that the outcomes were already predefined? And when you've made a decision that you've not felt comfortable with, how have you gotten over it? Or is it something that still sits with you? Because as we reflect on doing things differently, it means designing things differently. It means intentionally peeling back the layers of the onion, as it were, going back to the blueprint of the house, going back and digging deep, looking at the foundations and actually asking ourselves, can I do something different? Am I willing to do something different? And if I make those changes, how much will it improve my sense of self, sense of satisfaction? How much will it improve my leadership? How will it improve my personal presence? All of these things are interconnected. All of these things are interconnected. And once we start to see the interconnectedness of the systems, I hope that instead of feeling overwhelming, it feels like something that you're ready to engage with as a topic, you're ready to start to think about. And if it's something you're ready to change, then of course, send a message and we can talk as to how you can work on that. But, the purpose of the architecture of change is to really, as much as design solutions together, it's also to help drive new processes of thought, new ways of living, so that we not only live with intention, we plan with intention. And that, for me, is the start, or one of the starts of all of those changes, organizational change and societal change, is the recognition of structures and systems that are there, deconstructing them and doing something not completely new. As I said in a couple of episodes ago about leadership, it's not that we always have to completely start from scratch, recognizing value where it's there, but also being willing to make the changes when there is no longer value, no longer using outdated systems to try and approach not even new problems, I'm going to say new challenges that we've been loath to face previous to this. So thank you as ever for taking the time to watch or listen to The Architecture of Change. I'm Leanne Mair, your host, and I hope you follow wherever you can on LinkedIn, it's Leanne Mair. On Instagram, it's a Lifestyle Architect, as well as on TikTok. And you can find these episodes on audio on Apple, Spotify, and also my website. So as usual, happy Friday. And thank you so much for taking the time. Bye-bye.